Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm Kevin Kenny, Director of Gladstone Ireland House, and such a warm welcome to all of you. Particular welcome to our founder and chair of our advisory board, Loretta Gladstone. To Ted Smith, President of our advisory board. To all the other board members who are with us, and to friends of Ireland House. For those of you who haven't visited us before, Gladstone Ireland House is NYU's Centre for the Interdisciplinary Study of Ireland and the Irish diaspora. As a public-facing academic programme, we have a threefold mission: teaching, research, and public events. Our faculty teach hundreds of undergraduates in this building, these rooms, during the day. That's how we use them. We offer an interdisciplinary MA in Irish and Irish American Studies. We publish the Gladstone Irish Diaspora series, which features some of the best recent books on the history of Irish migration around the world. And every Thursday evening throughout the academic year, we host public events. This evening's event is a very special one for us, one we've been planning and looking forward to for several months now, with Martin Doyle in conversation with Fintan O'Toole. Martin Doyle is books editor of the Irish Times, where he's worked since 2007, former editor of the Irish Post in London, also worked for the Irish Times in London. His essays have appeared in the 32, an anthology of Irish working class voices, and in the handbook of the Northern Ireland Troubles and the Peace Process. He edited a history of the Irish Post. Martin was also, as you may know, an extra in Father Ted. He is the author, most recently, of course, of 2023 of Dirty Linen, the Troubles in My Own Place, my home place. An intimate personal history of the Northern Ireland conflict, told through the testimony of friends and families of more than 20 victims who died violently in his own rural parish in County Down. Martin enjoys a form of access that only a trusted local could gain, and layers this, and I quote, with the literary sensibility of a books editor, the storytelling ability of a veteran journalist, and the sensitivity of a writer who has experienced personal bereavement. Not surprisingly, Dirty Linen was shortlisted for the Irish Nonfiction Book of the Year. Welcome to Ireland House. And welcome back, Fintan O'Toole. You've been here before, of course. Before my time, this is my first opportunity to welcome you into the House in my role as director. It's so great to see you again. Do I need to introduce? Well, Fintan O'Toole is a longtime columnist with the Irish Times, advising editor of the New York Review of Books, winner of the Robert Silvers Prize for Journalism, the Orwell Prize, and the European Press Prize. He's currently working on the official biography of Seamus Heaney. Born in Dublin in 1958, Fintan is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and an honorary international member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He taught for a long time at Princeton, where he was professor of Irish letters. His many books, which I've read, include Trader's Kiss, White Savage, one we've talked a lot about, William Johnson and the Invention of America, History of Ireland in 100 Objects, Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain. And Fintan's most recent book, which we all know, we don't know ourselves, A Personal History of Ireland Since 1958, tells the extraordinary and occasionally surreal story of our homeland, year by remarkable year through his lifetime and indeed my own. Book of the Year on Post, Irish Book Awards, one of the 10 best books of 2022 by the New York Times. That's quite enough for me. Over to you.
Pat Campbell worked on the production line in Down Shoes the shoe factory that was by far the biggest employer in Banbridge since the linen industry collapsed in the 1950s, hence the white coat, which Donna helped him to take off every night. One day, she put her hand into the pocket and found a scrap of fur, which he had clipped from a pair of slippers he'd been working on and absent-mindedly put in his pocket. It was only a wee tiny piece of fur, but I got so excited, Donna recalls. I just loved the feel of it, and so every so often then, he would have took home only a wee tiny piece, and I used to keep them in a shoebox, and when I was going to bed at night, Mummy says I had all the fur out. I don't really remember, you know, I was only 4 or 5 years old, and they would have waited till I was sleeping, and then took the fur and put it in the box under the bed, and that was the ritual every night. In about 2007, when the police were reinvestigating her father's murder, Donna was going through a very hard time. She was happily married to Paddy Barry, an old primary school classmate of mine from Lawrencetown, and had 3 of her own children, but was suffering from depression. I always had depression, you know, as a teenager, and just never connected it to my daddy's death. But I remember it was a Saturday night, and the boys was in bed, and Paddy saying to me, and he wasn't being nasty, Donna, you're going to have to pull yourself together or you're going to end up in the ETU, the emergency treatment unit. And them 3 children is depending on you. And I took the huff and I went up to bed and I pulled the quilt over me and I said, think of something else, think of something else. I had this photograph of my dad and me lodged in my head, but I couldn't find it. All I could think about was I must leave that coat into the cleaners because I can't wash it in the machine with the fur on it and the fur. This came into my mind and I had such a feeling I got. I could feel my daddy's arms around me and I could see this box of fur and the comfort that I got from that box. And before this, Mummy had been telling me, Donna, talk to your daddy and he'll answer you. Talk to your daddy and you'll get peace. I phoned Mummy the next morning and I didn't even get the words out. She says, your daddy spoke to you last night. And I said, it's not that he spoke to me, Mummy, he was with me. And she asked me about it and she says to me, do you remember the box of fur? And I says, no, Mummy, but the feeling I got from that box of fur, I never ever had such a feeling of peace. So she told me about it. Donna's mascara is running, and as she dabs her eyes with a hanky, her tears are black.
Thanks, Martin. I think that gives people a sense of the extraordinary novelistic detail in the book, and it's the detail, of course, that makes the stories real for people. And one of the things that's so striking about this book is we think of history as linear. You know, there's a past and there's a present and there's a future, but of course we don't live it that way. You know, the dead things that have happened in the past are still alive for us, and that's what you do so brilliantly, is allow the people you talk to give us as readers that sense of simultaneous presence of this unresolved past or unresolvable past and people's continuing lives. You mentioned, one of the things I just want to talk to you about is this, what's not talked about, what's not spoken of. You know, the very title of Dirty Linen, you know, washing your dirty linen in public, and you make brilliant use throughout the book of the imagery of linen itself. But let's just unravel a little bit about this. So it seems like there are 2 things going on. I mean, one is the trauma that people are not given a context in which they can really speak about it. But the other is our very deliberate suppression of some of what happened. And you mentioned this figure, Robin Jackson, you know, which possibly one of the biggest serial killers in Irish history. The vast majority of Irish people would never have heard of him. And maybe even in the North, most people would not know who you were talking about. Billy Wright, who was the other terrible figure, was kind of more notorious. So could you maybe just explain how it's possible that you could have a figure who could be directly responsible for so many murders and yet never be brought to justice, never even really be thought of as an important figure, you know, and I think people should know that.
So, how did he get away with it, I guess? Well, I think, well, to answer your question about, dirty linen and sort of, airing, stuff in public that it is not spoken about, the hard fact is that the British state, which is responsible for governing Northern Ireland and for, maintaining security in Northern Ireland, it has files in its possession, in its archives, that it has chosen to put a 100-year moratorium on being made public. And, you've got to wonder what innocent explanation or justification could there be for that? I, for one, can find no explanation other than that they have got something to hide. Actually, they don't have something to hide, they've got a lot to hide, in my view. And again, I put this in the context of, the actions of the IRA, who were responsible, or Republicans were responsible for the majority of the murders during the 30 years of the Troubles. That's unforgivable and unjustifiable in my book. But that's a narrative that we all know and we all understand. I think not enough is known, not enough is spoken about the role of the British state in not being an honest broker in the North, but in pressing a thumb on the scales of justice, and whether it's shoot to kill or collusion between members of the security forces like Robin Jackson and members of the Royalist paramilitaries. There's a lot that has not come out that needs to come out. It's very funny because I was almost following in the footsteps of a man called John Boucher when I was researching this book, because a lot of the victims and the families of victims that I was speaking to had also been speaking to John Boucher, because he has been investigating what's known as the Glenanne gang, which is this kind of collusion between people like Robin Jackson and members of the security forces in Mid-Ulster. And John Boucher is now the new Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. He is, the man at the top of the force, some of whose officers in the past were guilty of collusion. So it's challenging when you think that, the British government introduced a legacy bill last year, which effectively shut down a lot of inquests, or will shut down in a couple of months, live inquests into, murders and violent deaths that happened during the conflict. And yet they've been allowing who is now the Chief Constable of the PSNI to carry out these years of investigations. He just brought out a report into State Knife, the IRA, Felix Capitici, the IRA killer, who was also in the pay of the British state. So it seems to me there's a kind of a double standard or a contradiction at work here. They're advancing with a magnifying glass in one hand and with a shredder in the other. They're closing down in one hand and then supposedly trying to kind of get to the truth in the other. It's not a good look.
So there's a sort of official suppression of knowledge and of narrative. But there's also, and this is, the extraordinarily poignant aspect of the book, which is that it almost comes across that there's a shame to having been a victim. That somehow nobody quite wants to talk about the experience of victimhood. And I wonder why you think that was. What happens in an intimate society where all of these terrible stories, is it that people feel, well, we already know because we're there and we experience it, or is it that it's just too much to process for people?
I think there are several things at play, Fintan. I think, even when it comes to ordinary death or ordinary bereavement, there is an expectation on the path of society in the West. Perhaps I can't speak for other societies, but maybe in Ireland and Britain, perhaps in America, you're supposed to, at a certain point, if you've been bereaved, to kind of, get on with it and get over it and kind of, get back to work and, put a brave face on it and all the rest of it. And that's something that I felt, at a certain level myself. I was bereaved 10 years ago. My wife passed away from cancer. And so that gave me a sort of a bit of an insight into that kind of expectation, don't don't be a nuisance or whatever, or don't kind of, bring everybody down, let's kind of move on. And so I think what happens when it's violent bereavement in a conflict situation, I think it's going to be exacerbated. Yeah, there probably is an awkwardness about it. And like particularly, maybe if you're being difficult, if you're sort of campaigning for justice, if nobody has been convicted or even charged or even questioned in some cases with the murder of your sons, for example, but you're going to be angry and you're going to be demanding, that the police do more, or you're going to be demanding that the media, don't ignore this case or whatever. I'm thinking in particular of Eamon Kearns, whose two boys, two of the sons, Jared and Rory, were murdered 2 hours after the family had celebrated Roisin, their sister's 11th birthday party in their house. Eamon is a very understandably angry man, and like his anger took the form of, like, he wanted to serve, for example, he wanted a memorial to be put up in the graveyard near his home where his boys were buried, and a memorial not just to them but to all the victims of the conflict in the parish and that were buried there. And it was a kind of a divisive thing in the parish because some people, I think, were anxious that this might attract maybe loyalists to kind of come and wreck gravestones or so forth. But he was adamant he was going to do it anyway. So there is definitely a sense that, particularly after the Good Friday Agreement, there was a compromise there, which was in exchange for an end to violence, to secure the peace, paramilitary prisoners, both loyalists and Republican, were freed early. And most people certainly, but also most victims supported that because they had a very strong feeling that they didn't want what they had endured for that to happen to another generation. So like they saw a bigger picture and they were big enough to kind of accept that. But there should have been a quid pro quo. There should have been more done for victims, and a lot of the victims, as well as speaking to relatives of victims who died, I also interviewed several people who had been grievously wounded. Like Margaret Jamin was blinded in a bomb at Badlands in 1982 when she was working in a shop. Her friend Jennifer McNairn lost her legs in the Abercorn bombing in Belfast in 1972, 10 years before. They have a wonderful friendship. But they both felt very strongly that not enough was done to support them, whether in terms of compensation or just in terms of recognition at a national level, at a society level of what they had experienced. Not everybody experienced the troubles in the same way. Some people, it almost passed them by. Like myself, I kind of felt it kind of passed me by, and yet once I sort of delved into it, and my mom would sort of say it, and it reminded me that when I was 8, an elderly neighbor died, and my reaction was, who shot her? And she had just died of natural causes, but because our news bulletins were sort of saturated with violent death, bombings and shootings and whatever, the idea that somebody would die of natural causes just wasn't the first thing that occurred to me. So like I think everybody to a degree was sort of affected by it. I'm not saying nobody got away scot-free psychologically, but some people suffered incredible trauma. Like I think of the Feeney family, like I mentioned Pat Feeney earlier on, who was shot dead in 1989. Well, his uncle, John Michael Feeney, was shot dead in a separate shooting in Derry Darts Club in 1975. And his son Jimmy, who 2 days earlier had won an All-Ireland boxing title in Dublin. And he witnessed his father being shot. And he was able to describe, he'd been outside, it was in a kind of a shebeen, this darts club at Old Weaver's cottage, again, harking back to the linen theme in my book. But Jimmy had gone outside to the toilet, this is down an unlit country road, a Boreen, a shebeen down a Boreen. And he'd gone out to the toilet in a hedge, and then in the short space of time that he left the building to go to the toilet, the loyalist gunmen on foot came down the lane, kicked open the door and spread the place with bullets, hitting even the dartboard. Like, it was one of the most poignant things I saw, the kind of crime scene photograph, like a darts board with a circled bullet hole on it. You know, people playing sport, having fun, and then the bullet hole on a darts board on a sports pitch sort of thing. Jimmy witnessed his father's murder, and he was able to describe to the police what the gunman was wearing. And the only available light was a muzzle flash from the gun that was killing his father. And so he was able to say he was wearing blue jeans and Chelsea boots. And I thought to myself, like, what light could be darker? What light could be darker than the muzzle flash from the weapon that is killing your father? And that was the light that he saw by for the rest of his day. He ended up becoming an alcoholic and taking his own life.
Oh.
So like, this is trauma. I guess a theme in the book is that trauma passes down through generations, and it's often unresolved. And some people might say, why rake up the past and why reopen old wounds? And I would say, you know, some wounds have never been allowed to heal. Instead, they've been contaminated at every turn by the failure of the police to bring justice to the victims' families, and in some cases, the collusion of the police in the actual murders in the first place.
One particularly cruel aspect of all of this is that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the bereaved have a pretty good idea who the killers were because of the intimacy of the society. You know, so the very things that we think about as being positive in a society, you know, the knowing of neighbors, all that sort of stuff, actually turns toxic because you may well end up seeing the people that you're pretty sure were the killers.
I'll give the example of, so my milkman was called Barney O'Dowd, and so that kind of brought home to my doorstep. You know, again, for the very first time, I think I was too young to remember some of the other murders, but Barney, you know, used to come to our door every day and deliver milk. And on a Saturday, he would kind of arrive to collect the money, and he used to wear a brown coat and a kind of a leather satchel around his body. And he'd allow you to kind of put your hand in, and it was full of coins, which for a child back then was untold riches. It was like a treasure chest. And so we loved him. Like, we had a rocking horse called Barney. My sister actually corrected me after the first draft and said it was my rocking horse. And my brother's middle name was Declan, and that was the name of our coalman, who was Barney's son. So anyway, in January the 4th, I think was the date, 1976, loyalist gunmen burst into the family farmhouse where there was a gathering. I think there's about 16 people. It was Barney's family, but also his brother Joe and his family, his children. And so Barney was shot and seriously wounded. He lost a kidney, but he survived. He's still alive today. He celebrated his 100th birthday last year, which is remarkable. But two of his sons, Declan, our coalman, and Barry, his older brother, and Barney's brother Joe, were murdered. Now, so who did it? Barney identified to the police. He thought he recognized the people who did it wore masks, but Barney thought he recognized the guy's face and his voice, and he gave the name to the police. And a couple of days later, the guy was arrested, and they did forensic tests on his clothing, and they found traces of gunpowder residue, and yet he was never charged. What else am I going to say? And also, just the night before the murders, a car with several people in it had pulled up and had ordered coal. And the family thought this was odd because they'd done a delivery of coal to that person only a couple of days before. So again, there's a sense that, you know, a suspicion that this neighbour was complicit somehow. This was a kind of a tracking. And I kind of make the comparison between, like, say, Doyle McNamee's book Resurrection Man, which is a novelization and a fictionalization account of the Shankill Butchers, and it's there's a sinister hum to the book, and it's kind of cars prowling the streets of Belfast in low gears, and just the sort of that sinister kind of suspicion in the north to be more wary of a slowing car than a speeding car for fear of what the people inside might be up to. So in this one here, there was that kind of neighbourly suspicion. There was a suspicion that the people who did this they hadn't come by car, they'd come across the fields. I've been to Noel you know, when I wrote that piece about my own memoirs of the trouble, I mentioned the O'Dowds murdered in passing. Noel, one of the sons, read it in the Irish Times and got in touch and said Barney was still alive. He'd love to meet me. The family moved south of the border. Kathleen, the mother, was traumatized, obviously, by what had happened, and also she feared for the lives of her remaining children, particularly her sons. So the family moved south to County Meath. And the detail, so Noel told me this story when I met him in Barney, and the detail that really kind of shocked me and, you know, made me kind of think about the long tail of troubles trauma is that when Kathleen died around the millennium, about 25 years after her sons were murdered, the surviving sons and Barney had a conclave and they discussed what they were going to do, and they decided they were going to rebury their brothers beside their mother in County Meath. And the detail that got me was that they did it themselves. They personally exhumed their brothers' bodies and put them into fresh coffins and buried them beside their mother in the south. And like that to me is trauma. That is like it's an act of love, but you know, there's a lot of damage there. And it felt like something like from a Greek tragedy. And that's what kind of, and as well as that, Noel said, would you like to see the farmhouse? And I wasn't sure, but I did. I thought, you know, I kind of felt almost like I had a duty to kind of to bear witness. And it's down this kind of, it's in a beautiful setting, you know, rolling hills, rolling farmland, and it's very remote. You can't see it from the road. You sort of, it's down like it's off a back road in the country anyway, but it's down a farm lane with a lock gate at the end now, and then you sort of follow a path that follows the hedgerows. And you come to it, and it's it was like a mausoleum, like it was a 1970s extended farmhouse, but it's all breeze blocked windows and corrugated iron blocking the back door, but you could pull it back and go inside. And like that was like kind of, it was very charged. Like psychogeography is an overused term or whatever, like, but it is absolutely fitting to walking through a house where, you know, where 3 people were murdered. And that had been left abandoned for 45 years. So that was very powerful. And Noel also, like the thing about Noel is that he wasn't just interested in telling me his family's story. He wanted to tell me every story that happened in the parish. And he showed me the cottage a man had been interned in August 71, a Catholic Republican. And the house had laid empty. Again, he had moved south after he had been cleared. And 3 British soldiers had been killed there. So all that was left was the laneway to nothing. And so, you know, we stood there and we contemplated that. And then he brought me to where the Very Darts Club shooting had happened. Again, the shebeen down at Bareen. Again, it's been knocked down, there's nothing there. So again, we're kind of contemplating, you know, a road to nowhere. And it was almost like, you know, putting your literary hat on, whatever, like it's kind of like, you know, crossing the River Styx with Sharon as your guide. And, you know, basically, like when I was growing up, there was like a dot to dot, you know, when my dad was from Wexford in the south, and we used to have these kind of accident black spot signs on roadways. So like, in other words, somebody has died here in a car accident, but we can't afford to fix the problem. So we're going to put up this sign warning you to kind of slow down or you'll be next. And so you had this kind of accident black spot thing. And so it felt like to me that, you know, the parish had these kind of, in my head anyway, I was beginning to see these kind of accident black spot things, the different places in the parish where people had violently lost their lives. So as well as I wrote the story of the O'Dowds, obviously with the family's permission. And at the end, I did a timeline of every victim who had died violently in the conflict in my parish. And I kind of thought that's, you know, that is a different way of telling the story. And like say, Susan McKay did a book called Bear in Mind He's Dead, which is based on a quote by the poet John Hewitt, which is kind of a broad brush kind of telling the stories of lots of victims across the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. Now, I kind of thought that was a very powerful and a very good book. But I kind of thought maybe by making the focus, by, you know, tightening the lens, just the prism of a single parish, you would get, you know, everybody knows what a parish is, what a kind of a small rural community represents. And if you can just sort of only tell those stories, you know, then that builds into something, you know, maybe pretty powerful as an arc over time.
Can I just ask you about the personal experience of doing this? Because in a way, you had escaped, you know, you went to college in Scotland, you worked, you know, kind of mentioned in the Irish Post in London, you know, you were sort of away, and then you were in Dublin, you were living in County Wicklow, working in Dublin. What triggered for you the sense of purpose, really, in terms of having to re-immerse yourself in stuff that you had to some extent personally escaped? And did you find that experience itself traumatic?
Okay, thanks. I do remember, like I say in the book, like in 1989, when Pat Feeney was killed, I had got away. I was a student at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, and my cousin Julie, two of his sisters are here tonight. She came over for a ball and told me what had happened. This is pre-mobile phone or whatever, like, so, you know, this was shocking news or whatever. And so, yeah, I've had definitely felt survivor's guilt. Here's me going to a black tie event, and I'm thinking about the black tie event of Pat's funeral that had happened a couple of days before without me even knowing. So that was always there. Yeah, I did definitely feel a sense of guilt. And when the two Kearns brothers were killed, that was in 1993, and again I was in London. You know, the two Kearns brothers had been, Jared and Rory had been at school with my brothers, Shane and Gary. So this is intimate. This is, you know, it felt personal, and it kind of felt absolutely it could have been me. So, and I was obsessed by the conflicts. Like probably one of the reasons why I worked for Irish newspapers in the early years of my career in London. I remember there's a website called Newshound set up by an Irish American called John Fay. And basically it was like an aggregator of just hyperlinks to the most important coverage of the conflict, and then later, happily, the peace process in Irish, British, and American world newspapers. And I would kind of pick on every one of those links every day, whatever. Like, it was kind of quite obsessive, I guess. So it was always something I never completely switched off. Well, maybe after the peace process and had bedded down, and you know, the war was over, the conflict was over, and you know, there was some kind of political settlement. I kind of felt, right, enough already, and I felt very tedious, the failure of the parties to kind of make a better fist of the gift of peace, if you like. But then, like, some things kind of brought me back, like Brexit, with the destabilizing effect that it had. You know, I was really angry about that, and I saw it. Like, we all saw it coming. Everybody in Ireland saw it coming. You know, the parties in Britain, or particularly the Tory party in Britain, I don't know whether they saw it coming or not, but they certainly didn't care, and they didn't want to listen. And then the murder of Lyra McKee, the journalist, a young journalist in Derry, that brought it back to me as well. 3 months before she was murdered, I'd done a thing of 10 writers to watch, young up-and-coming writers, because she was one of them. And you know, I remember sending me a DM to thank me, whatever. Like, and but she was from Doyle, I think, near where Anna Burns, who wrote Milkman, the Booker winner, was from, and Paul McVeigh, who's the one who commissioned me to write the original essay, Dirty Linen, and the anthology of working class writers. He was from Ardoyne, he wrote The Good Son. So I was kind of, you know, making a pattern or making a point. Here was another, you know, very promising writer from that small part of North Belfast. And it devastated me when she was murdered, and it felt like the cold, dead hand of the past robbing us of the promise of the future. So these were all kind of things that kind of, you know, when basically what happened was, like, I published this memoir, whatever, chapter in the Irish Times, which led to the O'Dowds getting in touch and writing about their story. So it wasn't a story that I was burning to tell, and yet it was a story that had been sort of, you know, bubbling away in my subconscious for all my life, I guess. Was it traumatic? It was, you know, it was difficult. Like, you know, it's not a pleasant experience to sit across from a grown man. I remember I interviewed Richard Beattie, whose father of the same name was one of those people, you know, blown up in the pub bombing in Guildford 4 days before the O'Dowds were murdered. The bombing was on New Year's Eve. And Richard had never spoken to anybody about, even his siblings, about what had happened. I guess he probably felt like, you know, we all experienced that together. We all know what happened, what's to be gained by kind of, you know, mulling over it, you know, again and again. But like for whatever reason, he was happy to speak to me. But it, like, you know, it was at times a painful experience for him. And I guess I hope a positive one. But like when he was sort of visibly upset, I would sort of almost sort of take the baton and I would kind of talk about my own kind of personal loss or whatever like that. So I did kind of feel, you know, an obligation. I kind of feel the least we owe these people, I owe these people is my time and my attention, you know, my care to sort of, I think they appreciate the fact that somebody cares enough to maybe tell their stories that haven't been told. Like I went to the newspaper library in Belfast and spent 2 or 3 days there furiously photocopying, you know, pages, and it, you know, that was kind of grim, like, you know, like going through like the Banbridge Chronicle, like I'm from Banbridge, which is sort of a, you know, a relatively prosperous, but you know, the troubles didn't really kind of tear it apart in the same way that it tore apart other times. But the Lurgan Mail, Jesus, like it was like chalk and cheese, and like the place was a madhouse. It was mayhem. Like it was a 50-50 Catholic Protestant town. You had the IRA, you had loyalist paramilitaries, you had the British security forces, and it was all going off. So that was, even reading that stuff is pretty traumatic, even at the remove of decades. Talking to people who had lost loved ones, I found it deeply moving. Yeah, like I said, I think, you know, I don't think I was traumatized by it. I think, you know, when I was bereaved myself, whatever, I think, you know, it changes your outlook on life or whatever. You know, it gives you a darker view of the world or whatever. Like it makes you more aware of your own mortality. And Declan had such amazing resilience that, you know, he basically followed in his father's footsteps. John Michael was master of the, not the master of Oxford, he was the number two of all people, Brian Faulkner, who was the last Unionist Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. It's incredible the intimacy of these stories. So his dad had been number 2 to Brian Faulkner in the Ivy Harriers, which is the local hunt. Faulkner died, I think, a year or 2 later in it falling from a horse. But Declan went to England, joined the hunt, followed his father's footsteps, and ended up hunting regularly with the future King Charles. So it's remarkable that, you know, despite all that he had kind of been through, he could have these relationships with Faulkner and with King Charles. So it's a celebration of the power and the resilience of human people as well.
Martin, I might just interject for a moment. We have an audience here who are deeply invested in the subject, and I'm sure if you're both willing, we might open it up. Just to use my host's prerogative with the first question, then we'll pass the microphones around. If you wouldn't mind using them, we can hear each other from one room to the other and pick it up on the audio feed. Sort of firstly pay tribute to you, Martin, for the extraordinary, visceral, compelling power of what you've done here. And you know, I couldn't help thinking as a historian of the enormous significance of linen in Irish history. There was once a thriving linen industry, domestic-based linen industry, right across Ulster and parts of North Leinster, and before the linen triangle and then became the murder triangle, there was trauma involved because there was a mechanization of that industry, which, in the words of Kirby Miller, transformed vast stretches of that country into rural slums. I'm quoting Miller there. And there were 2 responses to that. One was emigration. The highest rates of emigration were from North Central Ireland as a result of the mechanization of the industry. The other was violence, involving Maguireism and the rest of it. And I couldn't help putting your powerful analysis in that context too. Forgive me if I missed this earlier, but when did you hit on the title? Was it always there for you growing up, or did that emerge?
No, it's what like Dirty Linen was the title of the chapter that I wrote for Paul McVeigh's anthology. I guess it was a fusion of a few things. My grandfather's story, discovering a wider context of sectarianism in the linen industry. Like, for example, Catholics were, like somebody said, around my mother's generation, somebody said, "Oh, I'd love to be a mechanic in Guildford Mill," and somebody just laughed at them and said, "Catholics do not get those jobs; they get the bottom of their own jobs." And similarly, the O'Dowds, like I start the O'Dowds chapter with an account from a local historian did a history of the parish going way back to 1641, but also to around 1798, the United Irishmen, but also the formation of the Orange Order, and a lot of Catholics working in the linen industry, weavers, basically Catholics were dispossessed of their land, and then they turned to weaving looms in their own cottages, but then obviously that posed another economic threat to their Protestant neighbours, their planter neighbours, and so their looms would be wrecked in their own homes, and hundreds, if not thousands, of Catholics from the O'Dowds, long before the O'Dowds, left because of the bans that happened to them. 200 years before, O'Dowds were fleeing from the man-killing parishes to go to Leitrim and Mayo, because they were being persecuted for being economic rivals as much as anything else. So say Dirty Linen, and I guess the third leg was discovering Lint Water, the poem by Seamus Heaney, which he was published in the TLS in 1965, and he used sectarianism. He used the poisoning of water, of nature, by the processes in which, like, flax was kind of rotted in water in sort of dams, and then sometimes the water would leak out and there would be a fish kill. And so the poem Lint Water starts: putrid currents floated trout to the loch, their bellies white as linen tablecloths. So he was using the stench of sectarianism associated with the linen industry as a metaphor for the wider sectarianism in the north as a whole. So absolutely, those were the kind of things. And I didn't really have to go looking very far for other kind of cultural references. So like Paul Muldoon, his father, went back to Ireland from England to grow flax during the Second World War as part of the war effort. And he wrote, several poems, Glad Rags is one of them, about the linen industry and the class thing, where Catholics would be on the bottom rung and the linen lords would be on their impossibly high horses, as he described it in one of his poems. Michael Longley, he wrote The Linen Workers, about the King's Mill massacre, where 10 Protestants were murdered by Republicans, by the IRA in South Armagh, in retaliation for the murder of the O'Dowds, actually, and the Reeves 2 days before. But he also wrote a beautiful poem, which I'd encourage you all to read, called The Linen Industry, which Michael generously allowed me to quote in full, because it's a celebration of love, not a dwelling on of hatred. But linen is in the very fabric of the North. It's flax is the logo of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and it's a very rich metaphor. The vitriol that I kind of mentioned earlier on as part of the bleaching process. A Quaker introduced vitriol to the area in Moyallen to kind of get the industry started. But I make the point that Ian Paisley introduced vitriol into Northern society. Like he came to Eamon Kearns, remembers him coming to an Orange Hall, which is a stone's throw from the Catholic Church in Clare, where Eamon's murdered boys are buried. And he says he introduced vitriol. He introduced hatred into the local community, the Protestant community, by the virulence, by the vitriol of his dialogue.
Will we maybe take a question from this side, just so we know you're not neglected? So yes, but actually, we'll take two together, perhaps, if that's okay with you, Marcus. So,
If I can first begin with a memory and an observation for Martin, and then a question maybe for both of you. I think it was 10 years ago that we had the launch here of Lethal Allies. And just a powerful memory from that event, which was and went through the sort of geography and the history, particularly Robin Jackson's killings.
Yes.
And afterwards we had a reception, which I hope we'll have here shortly. And one of the O'Dowds was here, one of the cousins.
Okay.
And the question became about the investigation of the murder. And we asked, you know, the discussion was, how thorough was the investigation? He said, I have a bullet from that gun that we dug out of the wall a month afterwards. A month after the murder, there was no investigation. Right, there was no forensics, no real forensic study. So there was someone dressed, but the larger question of how that murder. Now, this is someone who was here in New York, and when we were discussing this, the catch in his chest, and it was immediate that we were talking to someone who was traumatized, who was in the room that night. So so I know you've heard this, that's sort of lived through that story many times, but it leads me to the question that I might pose to the two of you. Will it a different British government possibly change and repeal the appallingly named Legacy and Reconciliation Act? Do you consider that to be a possibility from what you know of how this was passed or the politics of it? Because I know from all of my friends and colleagues in the North, this is on both sides of the community. This is one of the most grievous injuries that's happened in the whole post-Troubles era.
If I could maybe take that one, I think Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the opposition in Britain, that's one of the few things he has actually pledged to do. He said he will repeal that act. He's a former head of the Department of Public Prosecution, so you know it is his turf. But you know, is that enough? Like, that's just undoing one egregious recent act of legislation. Really, there needs to be a cleaning of the Augean stables. There needs to be the sunlight of disinfectant on all of those files. Obviously, some of them there will be good reasons why. You know, maybe to protect the identity of some people who might, who might be at risk of assassination, perhaps. But you know, there has to be a bit more accountability. I think, you know, a government, like, you know, for example, there was a book recently about the dirty hand thing, the socialist government in Spain. Paddy Woodworth, a colleague of ours, wrote a very good book about how Spain held to account the politicians and the members of the security forces in Spain who were involved in the dirty war against ETA. There's never been anything like that, or the prospect of anything like that happening in Britain. Like, you know, as one of the people that I interviewed, Philip McConville, you know, his mother was paralyzed in the very bingo bus shooting. You know, the tragic banality of these descriptions of these murders, bingo bus shootings, darts club shootings. But he said to John Boucher, you know, we've had Stalker, we've had Sampson, we've had Sir John Stevens. These are all former British chief constables sent over to sort of clean house, and they're all, in his words, they were all run out of Dodge. In other words, you know, Stalker was sort of, you know, was set up, was smeared. Was it Stevens? There was a firebombing of his supposedly secure offices in an army base in Lisbon, I think. You know, there is a resistance from definite parts of the British establishment against the, you know, the unearthing of truth, unfortunately.
Very briefly, I mean, it's a great question you ask. I mean, I would have some optimism about Starmer because of his deep commitment to legality. You know, whatever else he has. You know, he is a lawyer, and he is a passionate lawyer. He also did spend 2 years as the human rights advisor when the police system, the new police system was being set up. So he has actually a lot of personal connection to it. A lot of people around him, oddly enough, are Irish. So the Sue Gray, who's probably going to be the most powerful woman in Britain after the Labour government comes in, has very strong connections to Northern Ireland. So I would be somewhat optimistic that there might be some kind of movement forward. But the movement forward that needs to happen, right, is not rocket science. It's, everybody knows it's been repeatedly promised. It's been repeatedly agreed to that there will be a truth and reconciliation process, and there never has been. Why? Because everybody who has power has an interest in there not being one. The British government does not want all the dirty linen to come out. Remember, this is a government which shredded millions of documents as it left left Kenya, left Aden. The shredding of documents has been a big part of the decolonization process, so-called. Sinn Féin really doesn't want it, kind of wants it, but this Scappa-Teach, I think, for example, we're finding out a lot more and more about how the IRA was also very heavily penetrated by British intelligence. There's lots of stuff that people don't want. And of course, the DUP, which can say, well, we never killed anybody, but I mean, Ian Paisley, as you mentioned, was indirectly responsible for a vast amount of killing.
There's a better way of telling history, and that's to tell it in the round and to sort of put side by side the victims from every community. It's actually a very funny thing, but there's no graveyard in the village of Guildford because the linen lord, who was a very generous benefactor, he funded the building of the Protestant and Catholic churches in the village, but he didn't like to look on. He didn't want any reminders of perhaps his mortality. So Catholics and Protestants are buried elsewhere in the parish. Protestants are buried in Tullalish graveyard, which is a town land, and Catholics are buried either in Lawrencetown or in the Clare, not County Clare, but the Clare, another town land. And I guess my vision for the book is to have side by side. They did live side by side, and they may have died side by side, but not buried side by side. But in my book, you will turn from reading about the murder of Richard Beattie and the two other Protestant civilians who were horribly murdered in a pub on New Year's Eve. And then the next chapter is the terrible murders of the O'Dowd's families. So you can't have one without the other. In other words, you can't come away from reading my book, stoking up maybe a one-sided or a grievance, a community-based grievance. I say in the book somewhere that the victims are my tribe. I'm from a Catholic nationalist background, and I believe in the United Ireland. I believe a reunited Ireland. I believe that is ultimately the best way of kind of putting the past behind us. So I've lost the turn of thread. I identify far more with Richard Beattie or Robert Harrison telling me the story of his thing, rather than just identifying with Catholic victims. That's very clear to me coming away from that they are my people, very much so. Thank you. I disagree.
I think we have to probably, while there is a reception, it's a really good note to end on, though, because of course all of this is about dehumanization. That's every single conflict is possible because there's mechanisms to dehumanize other people. And then once you dehumanize people, you can do anything you like. There's no boundaries. And one of the only answer to that is rehumanization. And this is a great book of rehumanization. I mean, it actually brings names that we might have seen in a list, and it brings back the reality of their lives, the reality of their suffering, the immense loss that every single one of us experiences when a human being is murdered, whether in our name or not. Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And I think that, is the subtext of this wonderful, wonderful book. And
So we need to leave room, time for Martin to sign some books. We have this book outside. We would invite everybody to join us downstairs for reception. Martin, do you want to say a final word?
Well, I guess simply I'd like to thank you all,